Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today we're going to be talking about kind of a philosophical, kind of macro concept. The best that I can come up with as far as like how I would kind of label the topic is in the realm of like the lurches of society. And sort of we lurch forward, we lurch back. Embedded though within this lurching that we do is self-destructive potential. That's going to be a big subtopic today, is why are we prone to self-destruction as a society? And as psychodynamic folks, we understand that this is present in all of us. Any one of us, myself included, has a self-destructive potential. This is natural, innate. This is something that we all develop, but we develop different ways of coping with this tendency over time. And we'll get into later, how can we understand the people who are engaging in self-destruction a little bit better? So the reason why this topic feels really important is, one, just the day and age. Like, where are we at as a society? Or let's just say, like, as a world at large, like, where are we at? It is a tumultuous time. Now, you go back in history, you listen to past generations, and everybody will always be able to point out something like, well, we're worse off than we were before, or there's, something really dire or big going on. And it's not that that's incorrect. It's just relative to overall suffering or adversity or conflict. That's not always like, relatively, it's smaller. But I think objectively speaking, when we look at today's day and age, whether it's American-centric or if you live somewhere else in the world, there's a lot of conflict. We are grappling with a lot. And when you look at the passage of time, sadly, there is this sort of tendency for us to engage in this sort of self-destructive potential once every, 30, 40, 50 years. It's been a while since we've had a world war. Those are like those big ones. Those are the sort of world-defining moments that we have less frequently. But we seem to flirt with destruction pretty frequently for whatever reason. We are, as a society, as this sort of amorphous entity, we're not good at staying stable for very long. And we're not necessarily really good at lurching forward repeatedly without taking a lurch backwards. There's something about the progression of the human condition that does require self-destructive potential. It's very sad in a way. I come from a profession that's all about like health and trying to make things better. So it's very interesting for me in my profession to intersect with this idea of like, yeah, destruction is around a lot of corners for us. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, I've got a depressive bend about me, and part of that depressive bend includes a lot of pessimism about people, a lot of cynicism about the potential for change in healthy ways, and that might sound antithetical or like against what you would want to hear from a psychologist. Excuse me, but I think it's just reality. I think it's one of the strengths when I talk to folks dealing with depression. It's one of the strengths of depression is we are willing to encounter tough realities, even if it is dysphoric in nature. And that's an important thing in the human condition, to be able to grapple with reality and not just be endlessly optimistic. And so I think it could be very validating, especially in this day and age, to say, yeah, it's tough right now. It is tough right now. And there's a lot of conflict and there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And it is far better to lean into that and name that than it is to deny it and try to act like we can just cope around this without talking about it. From a psychodynamic lens, you cannot and you should not deny the existence of something. You have to lean into it and understand what it is, because it will come up again if you ignore it. And maybe that's part of the lurch, is that we have a tendency to really want the good times. And when those good times come, we want to relish it. However, unfortunately, during those better times, we tend to neglect things. And then as that neglect builds, we then have a reckoning of kinds or sorts, and conflict is upon us, and then the lurch, the lurch backward proceeds. It occurs. So getting to the point here of I'm a big imagery person, I'm a big metaphor person, and so the way I think of it is, the way I sort of imagine it to be, is imagine that there's a big net, right? It's like a hanging net, And all the people are in it. Or you could just imagine like the world in it, right? Like a ball hanging in a net. And all of the world and society is within that net. Arguably, each country, even divisions of countries or states or family systems, whatever it is, you could distill it small and smaller, and each system can exist in its own net. But we're talking kind of macro level here today. So within that net are all the people. And the goal of a society is to stitch a net, to make sure that we are creating something that sustains us and sustains the generations after us. That is one of our imperatives in life, is to contribute in some sort of way so that it doesn't all crumble. That underneath this net is anything you want it to be. It could be, a pit of lava. It could be a black hole. It could be a void, kind of the endless expanse of darkness. And we're trying to prevent ourselves from falling into it. Now, one of the important reasons why I say that it's a net is that nets already have holes in them. And I think it's important to acknowledge, because even if society is functioning quite well and it's stitched together very well, there's still plenty of holes in it where people can fall through it. Like, it is the essential task, or not the essential task. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a ceaseless task. Excuse me, my apologies. It's a ceaseless task, because you'll never get all the holes stitched. Like, it is impossible. Like, even if everybody's collectively stitching together, the wear and tear of society is inevitable. Inequity is inevitable. I mean, we should always push against it, but inequities are going to come up and people will fall through holes, because it's just how it works. It's systems that big, millions and millions of people, you're not going to not have holes. But again, it's important that we're at least trying. We're stitching, we're trying to piece things together, try to fill as many holes as possible within reason, so that everybody feels supported. And if they feel supported, then they can start stitching too. A collective effort of like, how can we empower and encourage as many people as possible to stitch at this net? Now, getting back to the not so fun start of this episode is like, yeah, it doesn't feel like we're stitching really well right now. and to which I say, yeah, I would agree. And it's important to name that. It's important not to collude with that idea and get us into a state of panic, just to name it and be very real that we're in trouble. So why are we in trouble? Well, let's examine the people who exist in this net. One, we've got the stitchers. Yay, right? Now, people have various degrees of stitching capability. Some people, they're stitching along real well. Other folks, they stitch in their own right. Other people are learning to stitch. They're newer, whether they're younger or maybe they're new to stitching. And, when we talk about like power differentials in the world, people with more power and privilege, they have the power to stitch more effectively because they have greater reach, or they have greater resources to be like, boom, I'm not going to just like stitch this together. Boom, here's a patch. And let's stitch this patch up, and then we've got this nice safeguard. Now, you all can probably guess where I'm heading, but I'm going to take the mid step here. The mid step is people who aren't doing anything. And they fall into two categories, in my opinion. One is the abstainers. The abstainers are folks that it's not like they're wholly abstaining, but they just kind of exist, and they look at systems around them and go, I don't know, I'm going to do me. Individualistic cultures are pretty notorious for having a lot of abstainers, unless they're called to a greater action. Collectivistic societies, they have their own problems where everybody is into, there's this sort of need to stitch, but it comes at a different expense, because then you could be stitching all the time and not tending to yourself. But I digress, not the central point. You have abstainers on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have folks who are resting. Now, this is another really key and important point, because if you talk to anybody who has experienced marginalization or like longitudinal experiences of adversity, they will tell you that you cannot be fighting all the time. You cannot be stitching all the time, or saying like, please, someone help me stitch this hole over here because I don't have the resources to stitch this hole. You have to be able to tap out and be able to rely on someone else and say, can you stitch for a while? I've been stitching for 6 months straight. I got to take a break. I need to be able to stitch effectively. I got to pull back here for a little bit. And so I think it's important to name that that's an okay thing. The goal, I don't want anybody to take from this episode like, oh, I need to be stitching all the time. No, you don't. No, you do not. In fact, that is unhealthy to be doing. You need to be able to tap out a little bit and take care of yourself so that you're not so exhausted you're no longer effectively stitching when you're stitching. So you've got the stitchers, again, the varying degrees. You've got the abstainers. You've got the people resting and recuperating. And last but not least, as you probably have already guessed, we've got the cutters, the ones who are actively cutting the net. Now, one of the interesting things about folks who are cutting the net, in my opinion, this is where I'll pull back. I mean, some people can be really pessimistic about this, but I pull back and say these folks, most of them, a majority of them, are not consciously believing or intending to cut the net. And this is really where society struggles quite a bit, because if you were to ask someone actively cutting the net, they're right there, right? They're like holding scissors in their hand, and then they go click, and then a rope breaks, and then they look at you. And you go, what are you doing? They're like, what do you mean, what am I doing? Like, you're cutting the net. And you go, I'm not cutting the net. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, you're holding scissors. These aren't scissors. This is a needle. It's got thread attached to that. That's not a needle. Those are scissors. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not cutting the net. You're cutting the net. You're probably cutting the net. You're telling me I'm cutting the net? No, you are probably cutting the net. Like, they will straight up tell you, and this is not like they're not trying to lie or mislead. They will straight up tell you they're not cutting the net. Firmly, unequivocally believe they are not cutting the net, but they are cutting the net. Actively cutting the net. And this is kind of a little bit of a mind screw for folks. Because when we look around in society and we're like, how do you not realize that that's probably not a good decision? That's probably not good for you, or it's not good for other people. And if it's not good for other people, you are hurting people who are actively stitching that. What the hell are you doing? This is why, because people tend to be self-preserving creatures. We tend to want to think the best of ourselves and say, I'm doing something for the greater good. There are very few people in this world that actively go, you know what I'm going to do? I enjoy cutting the net. Now, they do exist. But they are a minority of the folks cutting the net. The ones that are purposely cutting the net and will tell you that they're cutting the net, there's a few of them. One of them is, people vastly overestimate like true blue, antisocial, sociopathic individuals. They do exist. And they're pretty notorious net cutters. They will also abstain sometimes too, because they're just indifferent. They're like, I don't care, I'm going to do me. But typically, somewhere along the way, they'll cut the net for somebody. But the real tough ones are just like, boom, like a smirk on their face will cut that net. And they're dangerous folks. They can be very dangerous folks. Some of them learn just to follow enough rules, it's good enough. But when they have like power and privilege, they can be very, very dangerous folks. Narcissism is kind of an interesting one, because if you look at them and you say, wow, they like cutting the net, psychodynamic theory would readily tell you that is not necessarily the case. They will convince themselves that they are in the right and they are doing good. It is their sort of frailty and fear of powerlessness that will push them towards narcissism, and then they will preserve that at all costs. And I'm not trying to be like apologetic for them. Because they deserve ire, especially, well, let me say that gently. They deserve treatment, but they tend not to come in for treatment because the defense system is so strong. They're usually pushed in because people around them go like, you got to get your crap together, and or family members put ultimatums on them. But essentially, they are not like trying to do this. They are convinced that they are somehow better, they're doing something in the right, even if it's antithetical. Like, you could talk to excuse me, my apologies today. You could talk to somebody with narcissism, and they might cop to be like, yeah, I'm cutting this net, but that's because I'm going to construct something better. And you're like, okay, you sure about that? I don't know about that. I don't know if you're really helping out over here. So again, they're kind of in the middle ground. The other thing that we give a lot of permission around this is like when we're adolescents, we do actively cut the net. Now again, you're not going to adolescents and saying like, are you actively cutting the net on purpose? And they're like high-fiving each other going like, hell yeah, I'm cutting the net. I mean, some of them for sure. We've met those, or maybe we even have kids who are in that camp. But what's really important is net cutting is an important developmental milestone in that we have to, this returns to that psychodynamic concept that we all have self-destructive potential inside of us. And the beauty of adolescence, childhood and adolescence, is it gives us a time to kind of play with this, because we when we're that young, we don't have really sharp scissors and we don't have like massive shears. We just don't have that power and privilege in the world to be making that big of cuts. And so what better time to experiment with cutting at the net and messing around than when we're young? So they are actively cutting around, and they can really influence things for sure. Don't hear me wrong. But in many ways, they're sitting there just kind of gnawing at, it's like the kids' scissors, you're like gnawing at it, and you got like twist it if you're actually going to cut something. Like they're like, I'm trying to get it cut at it, which is great. Like you want them doing that. They're also notorious for abstaining to certain degrees. They're just, we talk about egocentricity. It's a normal time for adolescents, and even to a certain degree, young adults to be kind of in their own world, trying to discover themselves. And so as a society, we just kind of have to account for that for a certain degree. I mean, I'm not giving them like a total pass. They need to become increasingly aware and increasingly involved in society, but you cannot force that early. You have to let them go through that period, which leads me to another point that a lot of folks don't get credit for. And this comes with identity development. Now, identity development's tricky because you can add layers to it. And one of the big layers is when people are coming from a background that's not like part of the majority culture. The cliche these days, and it absolutely applies to things like race, but it could be really anything, any major point of difference. And what happens within identity development is it's not a linear sort of process, and I can go into further detail in a future episode, but it goes through what we call, and heck, I might have even put this in another episode already. Anyway, doesn't matter. I'll say it again. They go through periods of we can go through periods of my apologies. I call it over-identification. I mean, there's identification, but then also like over-identification with the majority culture, and then there's a period of disidentification. And much akin to the kids cutting at the net, trying to figure themselves out. That's kind of more in the disidentification realm. Well, we have to go through both. But what's really interesting is folks from historically marginalized populations, or again, in their particular community, they are more marginalized. That disidentification phase can be pretty filled with quite a bit of anger. And when we're adults with a good amount of anger, we've got an ability to cut. We really do. But it is, again, developmentally appropriate to be like, F this system. I do not want to deal with this system. And it's important to give people a little bit of allowance to do that. Because we have to, this is a little bit existential, but we have to go through these extremes to find what balance looks like. It's this sort of old, tons of philosophers I'm sure have talked about it. It's this old notion of like, to find what balance is, we have to explore what the extremes are. Ideally, we do it when we're younger, when we don't have very sharp scissors. But for many of us, it takes us a while to get to a place where we can commit to a greater society, because we've had to go through the pain of over-identifying and not finding a place, disidentifying as a means of like, F this, something needs to change, and then finding a middle ground where it's like, I still need to fight for change, but I'm also not going to burn the whole system down in the process. Not that everybody is trying to burn the whole system down, but there is an anger to it. It could be anywhere from cutting to abstaining. And that's an important allowance to give folks too. When you talk about like investing, you have to hedge your bets. You have to understand that there is the possibility of a certain amount of loss anytime we're investing in something. And so in this giant social experiment known as society, and society building, we have to understand that and give certain allowances that there will be people actively cutting the net for reasons that are developmentally appropriate. The problem, however, is that is not all of the net cutters. There are still people who will look at you and say, I'm going to cut the net because I don't like what's up, because I feel entitled to cut the net, because I feel personally wronged, because I don't like the change that is happening around us. And if I can't have it my way, we're not going to have it at all. And that is a really dangerous aspect in society. This sort of tendency to say, you know what, I'm tired of tending to this. I want to get rid of it and I want to start over. And it's kind of a curious thing. So, pausing and telescoping out further, if you go back to this existential ideology of like, well, the lurches of society are normal, so maybe these periods are called for. Maybe they're important. In fact, we have lots of metaphor that speaks to this of, rising from the ashes, that there is this sort of beauty that creation is far more meaningful after destruction, that forests are much healthier after a burn. This is where it gets really interesting for more nihilistic folks that I meet that say, you know what, I want to see it happen. I want to see it all burn down. Part of me is like, are you going to burn with it? Or are you conveniently hoping you're not part of the burn? But, there's this interesting notion of like, maybe we need to let this net like actually open up and people start falling in for us to actually recreate better. I'm not a firm believer in this. I think people will fall. We cannot avoid conflict. We cannot avoid the self-destructive potential completely. But I would think and hope that we should try to avoid the really stark periods of self-destruction. Like the world wars are not things we should be aspiring for or towards. Civil wars are not things that we should be aspiring towards or for. Are there ways where we can go through these periods of conflict that lead to greater productivity, like a controlled burn? That would be kind of the hope. So just kind of addressing that, because I think some people are like, well, I think it needs to crumble so we can rebuild. And we go, yeah, we need to deconstruct some things to rebuild them better. But there are ways besides like bombing the whole thing and then rebuilding from the ashes. Society, the sort of purpose of our progress is to get better and better at not necessitating that so much. Not that we will inevitably, or not that we will, not that we will avoid it, because I think inevitably something big will happen once again. We'll just have to see when and why. So that's kind of the theory. You've got the stitchers to varying degrees. You've got the abstainers. You've got the people who are resting, kind of tapping out from stitching. And then you've got the active cutters of the nets of society. Now, the dispersion of who is in what category is the next important point of the conversation. It's like, so where are we at? On my more cynical days and my more pessimistic days, I will straight up say 33%, 1 in 3 at any given time are actively cutting at that net. And part of me says, like, that's realistic. Now, again, because it doesn't say to what degree they're cutting. Some people might just be like flirting with cutting. They have a little knife, they cut a couple threads real quick and then they look around, they cut a little couple. Right? Not everybody's like, just giant shears just actively cutting at the thing. So 33% could be reasonable. However, if I pull back a little bit, maybe the more accurate interpretation is that there's 33% of people at any given time, that are cutting and or abstaining. Because think about it, they're of kind of a similar class. They're just taking out their resentments or disillusionment in different ways. So I think it's within reason to say, in a society, you've got 33% of people disillusioned and frustrated and not wanting to contribute in some sort of way for whatever reason. And that a subset of those folks are cutting at the net. And maybe that's the more conservative estimate, is somewhere like, 15%, maybe 20% of the 33% or something like that are actively cutting at the net to varying degrees. And I get curious what other people would think and what other folks would estimate. But that's my belief, is that it makes sense to me that 1 in 3 are not actively stitching the net of society at any given time. So, the problem becomes, you do the math, 33% of folks not doing anything. Or maybe we, go through a big lurch and something very exhausting's going on, maybe goes up to 40%. The math still works out, right? If you've got over 50% of people stitching, it might get precarious, but the net is not going to fail because there's sufficient people stitching, which is good. I mean, it's scary, but it's good because the math works out. The question, I think, for a lot of folks right now is like, are we surpassing 40% who are abstaining or cutting at the net? And you kind of have to wonder. What's really interesting, you've got a war in Ukraine going on, and there's some people actively cutting at the net, and some people would argue, as much as war is not something we should aspire to or towards or for, that the active fight for democratic ideology is in some way stitching at a net. It's proving something. It's kind of a litmus test, and litmus tests are important for a reason. So other people, though, might say, like, anytime we're encountering war, even if it becomes necessary, the fact that we're encountering it means there's a lot of net cutters going on, and we are fighting for the final threads. I should say the final threads, but at least the final ropes, because we're getting close to the 50%. That what happens then, people really start falling through, because there's no longer a bunch of holes in the net. There's just a gaping expanse that has opened up, and people are falling out of it. I don't know what I believe. It feels like we are at like 45% net cutting or abstaining right now. It really does. I'm tainted a little bit by being in the United States right now. I try to not make this political, but and then I say but there is a group of individuals that are much more on the net cutting side of things, and it's basic math. I mean, this is an apolitical argument I'm about to make. Is like, if you are against social progress, you're probably not stitching. We can argue finances and all sorts of stuff, because finance is part of the nets. You have to be fiscally solvent as a country to do well. You look at other countries that struggle with this, and they really do start to crumble. So it's not like that's unimportant. But when we're actively against other people and we're looking to suppress or disenfranchise or, act like, our job is just to let things go as they will, and, time will simply take care of it and everybody will be okay in the end. There's a nihilism attached to that, and there's a self-destructive potential attached to that says, like, we need to be careful. If you turn your back on your fellow people, you're no longer stitching the net. That is not how that works. Like, you have chosen to just neglect a stitching duty. It's good enough. I don't need to. Why do I have to help with stitching the net at all? Again, we're not asking for folks to be like buying 2,000 pounds of yarn and getting that work here, but like the active denial and saying, like, I'm not going to help with social progress anymore. I'm not going to help lift people up, or I'm not going to ensure that institutions are fair. And we're not talking like everybody needs 20 hands reaching out to them, but like, when we're struggling and we're neglecting or saying, like, I don't care as much about my fellow human being, you are no longer stitching. Or you become apathetic to the suffering of others. You are no longer stitching. You are no longer capable of stitching well, or you're only stitching in areas that help you, which is not how it works, because then the fabric that is fraying elsewhere is not being stitched anymore because you're only stitching for yourself. So again, I'm not trying to make that political. That is just like a basic thing, because it doesn't matter our political parties or in any other country. When this happens, this is the issue that occurs: is the stitching decreases and the cutting increases. Did I say that right? Decreases and increases. Yeah. So it's to me, it's just a basic fact, and you can apply that however you want based on your political leaning. I just think it's a relatively transparent, speaking of litmus tests, it's a relatively transparent litmus test of like whether or not you're a stitcher. If you are actively caring for and nurturing and empathetic and investing energy in encouraging other folks and in ensuring something for a greater good, that you're usually doing some degree of stitching. It might not be the best stitching. Maybe it's over stitching, sure. But we need to be careful when we start convincing ourselves that only certain people deserve stitching, or only certain areas, deserve stitching. Or we start convincing ourselves that destroying something is necessary, like utter destruction of something versus re-rigging of something is what is necessary for growth. So take that what you will. Maybe that's the point where people turn off the video or something like that. It just feels important to note. So the goal essentially is to empower other people to stitch. And we have to understand the risk is that when we try to empower other people, they won't always stitch. It's okay. Like the best that we do as a society is that we give people opportunities and we give back in a way that encourages this sort of reciprocity, as we call it, this sort of idea that, I'm going to stitch a little bit so you can stitch a little bit. I'm going to learn from how you stitch so I can stitch a little bit better. And maybe you can take from what how I've learned to stitch. And hey, I need to rest. Or hey, I'm really good at stitching this particular thing. Can I get you into a position where you can stitch really well in the way that you stitch? Like that collaborative effort is a beautiful thing when we can achieve it. And something that I think right now we desperately, desperately need to look at folks who are cutting at the net. And with some of them, be understanding and just go, that's got to run that course. But with other folks, really challenge them and say, no, you've got to understand you're cutting at this net. I often come back to this idea of like, intent will always lose to perception. Intent will always lose to perception. And so if you're ever in a position where you're like, I know what my intent is, you should ask the people who are subject to your intent what the experience of your intent actually is. And if the majority response is antithetical or opposite to your intent, then it would behoove you to honor that perception, even if it's not your intent. And so, if you believe yourself to be, one of the popular kind of liberal terms these days, I'm an ally to people. Well, who says? The people who need allies, go ask them if they're willing to answer you, because sometimes they get tired of being asked, and look to see, are you actually perceived as an ally or not? Because it doesn't matter what your intent is. Am I a good farmer? I think of myself as a wonderful farmer. I plant seeds, things grow pretty well. Well, go ask your fellow farmers. Like, well, I don't know. How good of a farmer am I? It's like, well, I don't know. You're losing 50% of your crops there. It's sweet that you think that's awesome, but those margins aren't going to help you, and you're going to you're going to lose business, and you're going to be out of business soon enough. You can believe it all day long that you're a good farmer, but it might be important. Or for the suppliers, they're like, I don't want to go with you. You don't produce well enough. Like, you're unpredictable in the produce that you create for us. You can deny that and just keep living on intent only, or you can honor the perception and go, oh shoot, it doesn't matter what my intent is. I need to grapple with the fact that people are saying this intent isn't lining up for them. And so the same thing applies. Are you a net cutter or are you stitching? Are you actually actively helping society? Ask the people who are affected most by your beliefs. And if they tell you you're cutting the net, sorry, you're a net cutter. And it doesn't make you a bad person, especially if you weren't intentionally cutting the net. But maybe you might want to take a look at yourself and say, my understanding of what stitching means is very different than what other people believe. And I need to figure out a way that works for me, that either I need to just pause and do nothing, because nothing is better than cutting at the net, and evaluate myself and try to figure this stuff out, or find a different way to stitch. And some of this is absolutism at play inadvertently. It's, there's plenty of people who actively cut at lots of parts of the net, but then they'll stitch somewhere else. I was kind of implying this earlier. They'll stitch in the areas, sadly, often that are more beneficial to them than other folks. But you can also find folks that will actively stitch for other people, but in really just segmented ways. And it's about like, can you generalize that a little bit further? It's good that you help. But if you help over here, but then cut over here, it's kind of zeroing out, and we'd prefer you to be more on the stitching side than the cutting side. So I don't know if this is making any sense, but the long and short of it is that's how I understand society as a whole. Inevitable cutting, inevitable abstaining, and necessary and inevitable stitching. And the lurches of society depend so much on how much and to what degree or to what percentage are people actively stitching versus those who are abstaining and or actively cutting at the net. The lurches backwards are when we get closer to 50-50. And the really scary times in our society and our history are when that percentage is jeopardized and goes past 50% because the net starts to fall apart. And then when we move forward, we've got far more people actively stitching and stitching together and celebrating that people stitch differently and celebrating that people can't always be stitching the right way or the way that we prefer. And there's this sort of just flow that just moves against this natural intrinsic nature for society to have 25% of us at any time not really stitching, but 75% stitching. Progress is going to happen. It's a beautiful thing. It's a messy, imprecise thing too. So it's not like this net is beautiful and uniform. It's all over. The threads all hanging out, people using different types of fabric. It's a hot mess. That's society though. Like it's the beauty of it is it's this organized chaos, but it's organized enough and there's progress enough, and that's when it's a really cool thing. We move forward. And again, we neglect things as we're moving forward. We're imperfect and we have to. It's just nature. We're going to be imperfect, but we're aspiring to do better. So for whatever it's worth, I think for a while we were growing a little bit blindly though too, and ignoring that there were some active frays, and now we're in a really frayed period and where we've got a lot of folks actively cutting. We've got a lot of folks questioning why they even want to participate anymore. And that abstaining is just as dangerous as the cutting. It really can be. I mean, it's different, right? I'm not saying if you're sitting over there going like, this is dumb, I hate this, that it's the same as someone like, viciously cutting at the net. But the effect, the end result is fundamentally the same. So I don't really have anything else to offer here. I wonder if it's like interesting or useful food for thought. I mean, that's the whole premise of this podcast channel, is to get people curious. So I hope it's at least an interesting and curious way of looking at the world. I hope for those of us who are really grappling with meaning and purpose, it's validating in a way to say like, yeah, it's kind of messed up and it's really it can be really scary right now. But there's also math to it. There's also something quite inevitable to it. The greater question for us is, what do we do about it? And how can we do something effectively with it so that we hopefully get more towards a stitching stage and a little bit less from the abstaining and cutting phase. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks for listening. And as always, stay curious.